bless your hearts when morning comes along. Animal crackers in my soup, do funny things to me. All the things you go for. It's like Mrs. Drew said, a little girl shouldn't be raised in this kind of environment. We thought that love was over, that we were real in love. How could there be a new way to go upstairs? Why are grown-up people's faces wrinkle like a lot of prune?
And I have a craving for avocados.
I'm alert tonight.
I'm a happy person. I'm optimistic, but I'm a realist.
For decades, Shirley Temple has existed in American memory as reassurance, a smile that arrived on cue, a voice that promised optimism when uncertainty was everywhere. She wasn't remembered as a performer in the usual sense. She was remembered as a feeling, a symbol of cheerfulness during economic fear. A child whose presence suggested that things, somehow, would turn out fine. The label came early and stayed fixed, America's sweetheart.
On the good ship, lollipop.
It sounded affectionate, protective in tone, and remarkably complete, leaving little room for anything else. What's notable is how rarely that label invites questions. Not about the conditions that produced it, not about what it required to maintain, and not about what happens when a person grows beyond the role that once made them indispensable. Shirley Temple's story is often told as a success story that naturally concluded, a child star who shone brightly, then stepped away. Clean, uncomplicated, almost inevitable. But labels like this don't just describe. They organize expectations. They decide which changes are acceptable and which ones feel like disruption. This is not a story about scandal, decline, or loss. It's a story about what happens when an identity is defined so clearly that growing out of it becomes the first problem no one knows how to solve. Shirley Temple did not enter Hollywood as a blank slate. Long before she became a national symbol, she learned how to function inside adult systems.
And learned discipline. I learned that time is money. I learned that it's work, not play. I learned the lights and how you'd feel the heat on your face or on your shoulder.
Her early environment emphasized discipline, repetition, and responsiveness. Performance was not presented as a special event. It was routine. Instructions were clear. Expectations were consistent. Approval followed precision. What she absorbed early was not fame, but structure. She learned how to read adults quickly, how to adjust her energy to what was required, and how to repeat success without asking why it worked. These were not unusual skills for a working child performer. They were survival skills in an environment that rewarded reliability more than expression. Importantly, this conditioning wasn't framed as pressure. It was framed as opportunity. Work meant belonging. Consistency meant safety. That distinction matters. Because the traits Shirley Temple developed, composure, adaptability, emotional steadiness, were later praised as natural charm. But they were also the result of learning, very early, that stability came from meeting expectations precisely. There was little space for unpredictability, little room for emotional experimentation, not because it was forbidden, but because it wasn't useful.
The mothers weren't allowed on the set then. This, of course, was against the rules.
This didn't damage her. It prepared her, but it also shaped a version of identity that fit neatly inside systems designed for control and repetition. A child who could be depended on, a presence that reduced uncertainty rather than introducing it. Those qualities made Shirley Temple extraordinary inside Hollywood. They also quietly defined the limits of how much change the system would ever tolerate from her. The first signs of friction did not arrive as conflict. They arrived as attention. As Shirley Temple's popularity grew, so did the visibility of how carefully her public image was managed. Her schedule, her appearances, and even her mannerisms were treated less like expressions of a child and more like components of a reliable product. One small but telling detail often noted in accounts of her early career was how tightly her working hours, rehearsals, and public interactions were structured under studio oversight.
And any time I misbehaved, or any of us misbehaved, I was put in the black box and they closed the door and it's pitch black.
What were you thinking in the box?
Oh, not much, I think I better learn the lesson I'm being taught by the director.
This wasn't unusual for child performers at the time. What made it notable was how little distinction existed between performance and presence. Shirley Temple was expected to be consistent everywhere, on screen, at events, and in interviews.
What I learned was time is money, and it's work, not play.
The reaction to this consistency was overwhelmingly positive. Audiences adored it. Studios depended on it. But that reaction carried an unspoken message. This version of her worked. What stayed with her wasn't the workload itself, it was the expectation that there would be no visible gap between who she was and what she represented. Any deviation, even subtle, would be noticed. This moment didn't change her career. It didn't alter her trajectory overnight, but it marked the point where her identity stopped being private and began functioning as a signal, a reassurance the industry learned to rely on. From that point forward, growth was no longer neutral. Change would eventually need explanation. Hollywood did not embrace Shirley Temple simply because she was talented. It embraced her because she solved a problem. During the Great Depression, studios were operating in an environment defined by uncertainty. Audiences were selective. Box office returns were unpredictable. What the industry needed most was not experimentation but dependability. Shirley Temple offered exactly that. Her presence became associated with financial stability. Films featuring her performed consistently, and more importantly, they did so without controversy. She represented a controlled optimism, cheerful without being chaotic, emotional without being unsettling. This is where the system and the individual aligned. Her discipline was read as professionalism. Her composure was interpreted as maturity beyond her years. The very traits shaped by early conditioning became marketable assets. Importantly, this acceptance did not come with protection. It came with expectation. As long as Shirley Temple delivered the same emotional tone, the same reassurance, and the same image, the system had no reason to interfere. Difference was tolerated because it remained productive. There was no need to restrict her, no need to correct her. She fit cleanly inside the role that had been created. At this stage, Hollywood did not feel controlling. It felt supportive.
Were there any secrets?
I don't think there were any secrets. No, they followed me around pretty well and took good care of me.
The structure that surrounded her appeared stable, even generous. But this kind of stability is conditional by design. It works only as long as the person inside it does not change faster than the system can accommodate. There was never a moment when the terms were explained out loud. No meeting, no warning, no explicit rulebook, but the expectations were understood. Shirley Temple's place in Hollywood rested on consistency, not just professional reliability, but emotional reliability. She was expected to deliver the same tone, the same reassurance, and the same version of herself, regardless of age, context, or growth. This was the invisible contract. Her difference was not rejected, it was curated. Her innocence became a brand, carefully preserved and repeated.
You are just the symbol of innocence in Hollywood.
What the system valued was not who she might become, but how long she could remain recognizable. As long as she performed within those boundaries, the relationship functioned smoothly. Studios trusted her. Audiences returned. The machinery ran without friction. What's important here is that nothing about this felt coercive at the time. But conditional acceptance has a narrow tolerance for change. There was no space built into the system for transition, no framework for growth. Maturity was not anticipated, it was deferred. This didn't create immediate conflict, it created pressure without language, a situation where continuing as expected felt safe and deviating felt risky, even before anyone said so. Hollywood didn't need to demand control. The structure itself did the work, and as Shirley Temple grew older, the distance between who she was becoming and what the system needed her to remain began to quietly widen. Without blame, without accusation, and without any clear way to renegotiate the terms. Hollywood systems are built around predictability. They do not respond well to uncertainty, especially when that uncertainty affects a proven asset. As Shirley Temple grew older, the qualities that once made her invaluable began to shift in meaning. Growth, which is natural and inevitable for any child, introduced variables the system had never needed to account for. Her voice changed, her appearance matured, and her on-screen presence no longer fit the narrow emotional range that had been carefully preserved. None of this was a failure. But within an industry calibrated to repetition, change is rarely interpreted neutrally. From the system's perspective, Shirley Temple's value had always been tied to emotional stability and familiarity. Audiences knew what they were getting. Studios could predict returns. Risk was low. Aging disrupted that equation. What might have been understood as development was instead read as uncertainty, not because she resisted expectations, but because the expectations themselves had no room for evolution. This is how misalignment forms, not through rebellion, not through conflict, but through timing. Hollywood did not ask whether she could transition into different kinds of roles. It asked whether the existing formula still worked, and once the answer became unclear, trust began to narrow. Reputation does not need an incident to change. It can shift through absence, through hesitation, and through reduced confidence in what comes next. Shirley Temple was not pushed out. She was slowly reclassified, from dependable solution to unpredictable variable. In systems like this, that distinction is enough. Once predictability weakens, investment follows it out the door, quietly, efficiently, and without explanation. The misalignment wasn't personal, it was structural. And the system responded the only way it knows how, by preparing to move on. The shift did not arrive with scandal or controversy. It arrived through data. By the early 1940s, as Shirley Temple entered her teenage years, the box office certainty that once surrounded her films began to soften. Projects that would once have been considered guaranteed successes performed more modestly, and studios noticed, not emotionally, but operationally. This wasn't interpreted as a normal phase in a child actor's development. It was read as a signal. Decisions around casting and promotion began to reflect that change in confidence. Roles were adjusted, budgets tightened, long-term commitments became shorter and more cautious. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no public fallout, no headline announcing a fall from grace. But the system responded all the same. In Hollywood, declining predictability doesn't trigger confrontation. It triggers distance. What mattered wasn't whether Shirley Temple could adapt. What mattered was that adaptation itself required risk, and the system had little incentive to invest in uncertainty when replacement options existed. The incident, if it can be called that, was not a single moment. It was a measurable trend, one that allowed studios to recalibrate without acknowledging responsibility. From an institutional perspective, this was rational behavior. The numbers no longer guaranteed safety. And safety is what large systems prioritize above all else. So trust wasn't revoked dramatically. It was quietly adjusted. Opportunities became conditional. Support became optional. And the relationship that once felt permanent began to loosen. Not because of failure, but because the system had already learned how to move on when reassurance stopped arriving on cue. Once the numbers shifted, the interpretation followed quickly. Hollywood did not treat Shirley Temple's changing reception as a transitional challenge. It treated it as confirmation of a limit. From the industry's point of view, her value had always been tied to a very specific function: reassurance without complication. When that function weakened, the system did not ask how to support evolution. It asked how to reduce exposure. Language began to change quietly. She was no longer discussed as a future investment, but as a past certainty. Conversations moved from possibility to maintenance, from development to containment. This is how systems protect themselves. Rather than naming uncertainty directly, they reframe it as inevitability. Aging was presented as something that naturally ended the relationship, not as something the system failed to prepare for. There was no need to pathologize her, no need to criticize her work. The shift required only a subtle change in expectation. What once counted as reliability was now described as limitation. What once felt stable was now described as complete. The most important part of this process is how little resistance it encounters. Because nothing overtly unfair appears to be happening. No rule is broken. No accusation is made. Opportunity does not disappear all at once. It thins. And once the system has read a person as finished within a certain role, that reading tends to persist, not because it is accurate, but because it is convenient. By the time Shirley Temple's career options narrowed, the interpretation had already settled. The system wasn't reacting anymore, it was concluding. What followed was not a downfall. There was no dramatic ending to explain, and no crisis to recover from. Instead, the system disengaged the way it often does when usefulness expires. Opportunities didn't vanish all at once. They narrowed, projects became smaller, expectations lowered, interest shifted elsewhere without announcement. This kind of withdrawal preserves appearances. From the outside, it looks voluntary, a natural transition, a story that resolves itself. But what's actually happening is structural. Hollywood does not like unresolved risk. When certainty weakens, the system reduces exposure rather than confronting change. It redirects resources. It replaces rather than adapts. Shirley Temple was not rejected. She was no longer prioritized. And because there was no scandal, no controversy, and no visible harm, the disengagement felt clean. The system retained its innocence. Nothing had gone wrong. It had simply moved forward. This is how institutions protect their narrative, by allowing distance to appear mutual, by letting absence stand in for explanation, by framing the end of opportunity as a personal choice rather than a structural decision. For Shirley Temple, the transition out of Hollywood happened without spectacle. There was no public reckoning, no corrective effort, no acknowledgement that the system had depended on her long before it had any plan for what would happen when she changed. The relationship didn't end in conflict. It ended in silence. Shirley Temple did not disappear. She lived a full life beyond the role that made her famous, but the version of her that remained in public memory stayed remarkably narrow. She is remembered as a moment, a symbol of cheerfulness, a face associated with comfort during hardship, an image that feels intact, uncomplicated, and complete. What's missing from that memory is context. The system that relied on her stability rarely appears in the story. The expectations placed on a child to remain emotionally fixed are treated as background, if they are acknowledged at all. Her transition out of Hollywood is often framed as graceful, even ideal, without examining why adaptation was never truly offered. This isn't about blame, it's about recognition. Hollywood tends to preserve its symbols while flattening the people behind them. Once a role is completed, the complexity that sustained it becomes unnecessary. The narrative simplifies. The system moves on. Shirley Temple's legacy survived because it was easy to remember. What didn't survive was the understanding of how much consistency was required to keep that image intact, and how little room there was for change once the image no longer fit. The question this leaves us with isn't whether her career ended too early or whether things could have gone differently. It's simpler than that. What does it say about a system when it builds its reassurance on children, and then treats growth as the moment that reassurance becomes unusable?